Hey, what's up? I'm Navarro Wright, and today I want to welcome you to the Connected Journalist podcast, where I have the pleasure of having one of the most decorated, award-winning, unique voices in journalism, Soledad O'Brien, today on the Connected podcast. All right, welcome to this episode of the Connected Podcast. I am beyond excited to bring this to you. The goal of the Connected Podcast is for me to connect with people who create things that bring us together, that connect us and make us better people. And I'm beyond excited to have someone on today that is, I could spend the next hour going through the accolades, award-winning
Do
journalist,
it, do it, do
producer,
it.
podcaster, social media, rabble rouser, you call it whatever you want. But most importantly, I'm excited to have my friend Soledad O'Brien on today. Soledad, welcome,
Hi,
welcome, welcome.
thank you, thank you. It's so weird for me to be on this side. I'm so used to interviewing you.
Well, it's funny. I laugh because, and I'm glad to have you on here. It's actually serendipitous because I started doing this more because of the Black Enterprise interview with you, because it put me out into the world. So I had no choice but to start talking. So
Yeah, yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I think sometimes people don't realize their expertise. They think it's just what they do. It's like, this is just what I do. And there's something that's just so interesting that I think everybody, it sounds like a cliche, right? But everybody has a story. And sometimes just deconstructing how people got where they are is just so fascinating, whatever they're doing.
Absolutely.
So it's great. I'm glad you're doing it.
No, I appreciate it. No, I want to, what excites me about this is I have the pleasure of knowing you for, it's been over a decade now. It's been a really long time. And, that you're an
Actually, it's
example.
going on 2 decades.
I know. I didn't
hate
want to
to tell
say it.
you.
I didn't want, women don't like to talk about age or how long they've known somebody unless it's married. So I didn't want to bring it up. But yes, it is going on 2 decades. But I really, want to give people the opportunity to kind of hear a perspective that I've heard just in relationships with folks about why they do things and what they do. And for you in particular, when I think about your background, and I laugh about this because people I've met, and then you remember kind of the first time you got connected with them. And with you, I'm going to really take you back. It was the site. It
Oh,
was,
no.
yes, it was me being a CNET maven, loving everything that CNET was doing, and then having this show that talked about the internet and technology.
That show had 10 viewers, and I think like 8 of them were my family members.
But then
That show had
I was
no views.
9 because I laugh because I watched it religiously. It was like, where else can I find out about current technology on a regular basis? Has
It
an
was
AI?
such a hard show to do because you had people like yourself, right, who actually were working in tech. And then you had people who were like, I'm a grandma now, and I really would love to figure out email because I'd like to be able to email my grandchildren. And that's kind of a wide range of ability. And we were trying to serve everybody. I remember once we were asked by somebody, do you program your computer so that you could set an alarm? And I'm like, buy a clock, dude. Like, why would you? I mean, this is way back in the day, but it was just such a funny thing to think, like, the steps you'd have to go through to do something when it would just be much easier to go buy an alarm clock and actually solve your problem right there.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to kind of the ability to tell stories in different stages, right? Like you would do that show a lot differently today than you would have back then. But it kind of leads me to my first question for you. Like, when did you know that you wanted to tell stories and why? Like, where did that start?
It really started with, when did you know that you did not want to go to medical school and why? And that was my junior year of college. I was taking organic chemistry with my sister, who's now an eye surgeon. So worked out for one of us. And she said to me something really interesting. She's basically said, you don't really have a passion for the science. Because I was pretty good at memorizing and regurgitating back things. It's what made me a good student, actually. A lot of education is like memorize it and then give to the teacher back what they want. And she would say, but you should be able to, you should understand that formula, like y equals mx plus b. You should understand that there's an xy axis and b is a variable in space. And the only way to come up with a formula that would give you a line is that. Like, she understood a formula, and
Right.
I did not. I could memorize it and kind of regurgitate it on a test. And so I think because of her, it became very clear to me, like, I'm just not passionate about it. I think I'd be good at it. I liked people. I wanted to be in medicine, but I just didn't the science part of it, like understanding the processes was not what was interesting to me. Helping people was kind of interesting to me. And I think that probably was my first glimpse of this idea of understanding people's stories, from that perspective. I started working at a TV, I left school, started working at a TV station. And that's when I realized, like, I think the first part of that job was very run errands. So I was good at multitasking, running errands, getting lunch, getting a sandwich, getting a soda, running a script. That was the job. But as I got better and more experience, then you'd have to figure out, well, what is the narrative of today? What is the story? How do you tell, what is the story worth telling and what's the one not telling? And how do you insert sometimes people into narratives where where a lot of other people think they don't necessarily belong? A lot of my time in newsrooms has been like, hey, there's a whole other version of this story in populations that we're kind of ignoring. So I think it was really as early as just figuring out I didn't want to go to med school, because what my strength was in caring about the people more than caring about the processes. And so that was my red flag to not do it.
So if that was the reason, how much did that feed into your style? So I think you have a very unique style of storytelling. Like, how did you come up with that style, and kind of what is the goal of that style?
I think when you start off, especially on camera, you try to mimic, like, that's right, Navarro, coming up tonight at 5 o'clock. We're expecting to hear from the mayor, and especially if you're young, you try to
Yeah.
mimic this older. And then eventually you just get comfortable with yourself and you realize, like, I can just tell people from my own perspective. I was always pretty good at capturing things and breaking them down. I'm not a linear thinker, so I had to really work on making sure I was hitting the points in the right order. That was something I really had to learn. But I think it's just a matter of getting comfortable with yourself, and then the more you're comfortable, the more you're transparent about what you know and don't know. And you don't need to be hiding behind the microphone in your fake voice and being very serious because it's a serious story. So I think that was it. People often will say, "Well, try not to show emotion," but I actually always thought it was the opposite. I think you try to be as human as you possibly can. If a story is sad, you should show emotion. I think that's a plus.
And I think you've done news journalism, you've done location journalism, but I think if I think about you and storytelling, I really think about the In America series, and
Mm.
I laugh because there could be people watching this who have never seen an episode of In America. So I'd love for you to just kind of talk about it high level, and then talk about like how you brought those people together,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
lastly, like the impact. Yeah, I
Yeah,
want to.
so CNN had asked me to do a documentary called Black in America. It was gonna be 6 hours, 3 days of 2 hours per day, and it was really around the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. I think that was the anniversary. In any case, so that would have been 2008, and the question became, okay, how do we tell that story? So the first 2 hours would be the story of Dr. King, who he was, and that whole narrative and the assassination and who did it, kind of the arc of that. And then we wanted to tell the story of the Black community, and where we really got it wrong. And I will take full blame for this because I supported cutting it up this way. We decided to do half the doc. The next 2 hours would be the Black woman and family, and the next 2 hours would be the Black man. And there was no reason behind it. But I think it was a really idiotic way to think about dividing a community, because, I mean, looking back now, it's utterly embarrassingly stupid way. And we got a lot of flack for it, which I took full responsibility, because I was like, okay, we got to figure out how to, what's in your 2 hours. But we basically wanted to look at a community, and it's very hard to chunk these things up, right? It shouldn't have been broken up that way. Maybe even do it by eras, right? The timeline versus
Yep.
groups of people. In any case, we were very interested in looking at America, Black America, post Martin Luther King's assassination. And then that was just a matter of, like, what are the stories that you tell? We would go on to do that doc series for almost 10 years. We would revisit it every year because it was so wildly successful. And I think it just had, which is crazy, in 2008, it just had never been done before. No one had ever done this, like, TV event. I think people would ask me all the time, like, well, who's this for? And it was so funny because it wasn't really for anybody. It was for everybody. I mean, it wasn't sort of like, here, white people, let me show you what Black people look
Right.
like. And it wasn't, Black people, let me tell you about, it was just, these are stories about people that often don't get a lot of coverage. And I think especially when you look at minority communities, there's just a lot of stereotyping and a lot of error and a lot of just just a lack of interest in really digging for interesting, accurate stories, right? People tell the thing they think they know, and they're often wrong. So that's what we wanted to do. We just wanted to look at a community and assess where is Black America in the years after the assassination of Dr. King. It was great. It was really groundbreaking, and it was very different. When you and I spoke, of course, that was probably the fourth or fifth year of doing
Yeah.
Black in America. And it was a look at, African Americans in Silicon Valley, which again was, I mean, think about it. Like, it was just groundbreaking.
Right. Right.
Imagine that someone's like, oh my God, that should be an entire documentary. And it was a really great doc, again, because people to this day tell me that they had never either A, thought about Black people being in Silicon Valley, or B, had no idea that there were so many Black people in Silicon Valley.
No, so it's funny you say that because, when you talk about not only how it impacted the people who watched it, I want to talk about how it impacted the people who were part of it. I think I may have had, if I did the count, 7 minutes of airtime in that documentary. But, what happened was, and it dates us, the only social network around was Twitter. I think I jumped to like 4,000 Twitter followers in 15 minutes while the documentary was airing. And I talked to Buster Sores, I talked to Angela Benton, and I think for all of us, and they were kind of the title leads in their respective docs. For all of us, it was that shift of, to your point, of identifying someone in a space that no one ever knew that they were doing this thing at this level, and they looked at them for advice. I mean, for me, I would get paid speaking offerings, and then I would get these calls where like, hey, we're a nonprofit in Virginia and we can't even pay for you to get here, but we've never seen a Black person who has a career in tech. Can you come? And I ended up taking a lot of those.
Yeah,
It,
because it matters,
it
right? It was
matters,
like,
right?
yeah, that was an impact. And I know you mentioned Buster Stories, right? He was the face of the doc that we did about the Black church, and I think it was called Debt Almighty, because of his efforts to see what he could do about the challenges around debt. African Americans over index in high debt, often college debt. So, I just saw him the other day, actually. And so it's so funny. I'm in touch with so many of the people who are in these docs. I get
Absolutely.
invited to the first Black in America. We did a story on a family that was holding their a family reunion. And it turned out that they had a white thread of the family.
Right.
The great, great, great grandfather was a slaveholder. And so now the white people and the Black people all go to the family reunion. That was the
Yeah.
first time that, we kind of brought them together. So yeah, I think that was a that series that really did have an impact, and at the very least just connected people and sort of said, there is a guy who's got experience. Like, you can, because of Twitter, you can track him down, you can find him, he
Right.
exists. And it was a way of connecting people that I think really didn't know about each other.
So, that was kind of your pinnacle for CNN, but from that, you kind of made the shift of starting your own production company. So I want to talk a little bit about how the way you tell stories has changed since you started your own production company.
Yeah, well, the challenge, of course, is when you work for a network, you have a platform. You just need to talk your boss into letting you do it. When you run your own production company, you have to find a buyer for your doc,
Yeah.
right? So we have docs that are on Peacock and HBO, and so we Discovery as well. And so you sort of come up with an idea, then figure out who's the buyer, and then you sort of work with the buyer around what the story should be, because every buyer has their, hey, our audience is this is what we need. When you're at CNN, that whole process is very easy part, because someone says, yes, we should do that. And they're going to tell you where it's going to air. And so that has made it harder, but in a lot of ways more interesting, because you can tell, I think we've been able to tell a lot of really important stories that maybe I couldn't have gotten on CNN. We did a doc for HBO that won a big award that looked at the number of Black and missing women in America, and why they go often unreported and unfound. We did the first documentary. It's insane to think about it, on Rosa Parks.
Right.
When we had these two great directors, they came in and pitched the project to us, and they're telling me, like, and if there's never been a doc on Rosa Parks. And on one hand, I'm like, and on the other hand, I'm like Googling
Right.
docs on Rosa Parks.
To make sure they're not lying. Like,
because it seemed impossible, right? It's like that cannot be possible, but it was true. And so that was a great doc. We won some awards for that. We currently have a doc that we've just sold to HBO that looks at an abortion clinic in Georgia post Roe v. Wade. And we have another project that is going to launch at Sundance next month. We'll be showing it at Sundance, which is a look at, it's called Perfect Neighbor. And it's a story of the woman in Florida who shot through her door and killed her neighbor. And kind of the idea of the Florida stand your ground laws and how that played a role in this killing. So, we've gotten to do a lot of really interesting projects that I think I wouldn't have had a chance to do at CNN necessarily.
Now, I know one thing you do really well is you're able to work with brands and still tell the story. So talk a little bit. How do you tell stories authentically when brands are involved?
I think things have just changed so dramatically that brands in the last really more than 10 years, right? Have had 10 years ago, they were starting to move away from an actor and a bare stage. And when they wanted like real people, they wanted people who weren't perfect, who looked like real people, who were telling their real stories. I think that very much tied with the use of user generated video, that people understood that they're very compelling, actual live people, that you could use them and tell stories through them. So a great client of ours was Genworth. And we were able to talk to people about who had an insurance, long-term care insurance, or didn't have it, and kind of problems that they had and why they wish they'd had it or how it helped them. We did a project for CoverGirl because CoverGirl had a project around just remarkable young women, and so we did a multi-part series for them. And so what I felt like I was just doing documentaries. I mean, we
Right.
were not, there was no acting involved, and I think audiences have really moved away from seeing people who aren't real or aren't talking about real things. So, for example, I remember once watching a video, beautifully shot, beautifully done, and it was about different families. And the family in this particular video, gay couple, two men, one was white, one was black, and they had a black son. They weren't in their house or anything. They just had him in a very stagey type, like white background with a couch, a fancy couch. And I remember, like, in that entire thing, talking about different families, nobody talked about race. Nobody talked about the fact that they were gay. Like they were
Right.
there being different, but they actually
Right.
like ixnay on the discussion about it, which then why bother, right? Like I wanted to hear, are you worried about your young black son in the community you
Right.
live in and policing? I mean, there's a million important things to discuss. And so I think both audiences and brands wanted real, right? They wanted, if they were going to embrace an issue and not just try to sell a product,
Right.
if they wanted to show their audience their values, then you had to have real conversations. So we really saw a shift, and we just do documentaries, and sometimes it's for a brand.
You mentioned user generated content, and I think it's a good shift and segue to my next question. Social media, right? Like, in being in your space, having to adapt to new mediums, talk a little bit about how you've had to adapt to social media and then how it's changed storytelling.
Yeah, I'm still in the middle of that adapting because it just shifts so quickly, and it's something I don't love. So I'm trying to figure it out. A lot of social media for me at the beginning was promotion. Hey, I've got a doc on. Hey, I've got a story. Hey, 12 noon today. Hey, do you want to do a chat with me? I've got a live
Right.
Q&A. That was it. And Twitter was a lot of that. Or hey, I'm in Haiti. We just had an aftershock. Hey, there's this. Now I think social media is about sort of building an audience and your own brand, and so I'm trying to figure out like what are those stories that I want to tell online, and how do I want to do that, because things do change constantly. I'm always shocked when people will tell me that you can find all the Black in America stories, right, on YouTube. People have just copied them and over. And I sometimes am like, well, I could just give you a good copy. Like I have a very nice copy. I mean, because educators will tell me they're using this terrible version of it,
Right.
many generations lost, as it's been dubbed over a zillion times. So I do think there's lots of opportunity to share the quality work that we've done to make sure that more people get access to it. And that for me is something that's on my 2025 bingo card of like, we're going to really work on that to make sure, because our goal is to, a lot of the stories that I tell, I don't want them just to be for people who have subscriptions or people who
Yeah.
can get past the paywall. I want it to be for people actually who can't, who don't want to be in the paywall, who can't afford the paywall. That's the audience that I want to talk to.
Do you feel like that's a challenge between the many hats you wear? So Soledad, the media production company owner who has to be profitable, versus Soledad, the journalist who wants everybody to see the story? Like, how do you balance those two?
Those two things are exactly contradictory, right? Yeah, I think, but I think that there's actually a model that can work. And that's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, what is the model that, and partly because I know lots of foundations will say to me, let's solve this problem.
Yep.
How do we create a platform where someone can go? We did a doc about college students who are hungry, who face food insecurity. It's a huge number of college students. I remember a friend of mine told me the data point is like 50 some odd percent. It's very, very high. And I'm sure it's even higher now. And it seems appalling to me that it's going to live in this one spot, and then the
Yep.
people who should see it won't. So and everything is negotiable, and you can navigate and you can do deals around. So I know it's solvable, but I would love to be able to say all of our projects live somewhere, because I'd like people to take them and share them. That to me would be impact, is that. And how do you do that? Often, as you know, you go to a conference,
Yep.
and the person who's speaking, everybody in the conference, they're the choir, or they're the preacher, right? And
Yep.
the person's amazing, and you're like, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if this person couldn't just live in our bubble on the website of this organization,
Right.
that the people who are already in the tent will pay attention? But how do we share that in a way that will help other people who don't know this stuff? And that's what I think I'm really working on.
Well, I mean, you mentioned, you talked about the Black in Americas being on YouTube and some of those challenges. Have you seen a shift in this world where there's so much content available in so many different places, a move away from qualitative content?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of junk, but I think there's just a lot of opportunity for really good stories too. What I've actually found is that you have you've just opened up a world of more stories. I mean, one of the challenges that's always existed is that newsrooms were kind of the gatekeepers, right?
Yep.
And so generally, I had to go convince my boss, who was normally a 60 dude who lived in suburban somewhere in the Northeast, outside of DC, outside of New York City, maybe an LA guy, right? But very specifically, and talk him into this idea that this could be interesting to a group of people. And
Right.
and of course, with the bias that people have, right? Often it's like, well, if it's not interesting to me, why would anybody watch it? And so, a lot of times people, I remember I had a boss right before I left CNN who said to me, I was pitching to him a doc about poverty. We were doing a lot of In Americas. And I said, I think poverty in America would be very interesting. There were lots of stories at that time about people who were working full time, who were living in their cars, who had good full time jobs, like
Yeah.
a real job. And he said to me, "Ew, who'd want to see that?"
Right.
Now, of course, we just actually did that project for the show that I do now, but I think a lot of people would, right? I think actually the idea that people feel so close to the edge, that they're working and they feel like they're constantly behind and can never get ahead, played a big role in the election, has played a big role in where we are. I think the gap between haves and have-nots is really
Yeah.
problematic. So it's not like it doesn't matter, but because he's the gatekeeper, that was just not ever gonna make air. So I think what's happened is, sure, there's a lot of stuff out there, but really it's opened up a lot of voices. Then something connects and everybody says, oh gosh, we didn't even know we wanted this. This is amazing. And usually it resonates
Right.
because it's very real. It doesn't resonate because it's so beautifully shot and so beautifully told. It resonates because it's like, holy cow, that is just raw and real and interesting.
Yeah, it's better than anybody. I preach to the world about, the opportunities are right in front of us, and if you have a cell phone, you can tell stories. And I even laugh looking at you. I remember a day when if I had said, Soledad, let's put a mic in your bedroom and throw some headphones on and create content, you would have looked at me and laughed. But now you've done it, and now you've done an award-winning podcast with Rob Reiner. So that shift even
We
hit Soledad, just so you
we
guys
did our
understand.
entire broadcast for our show Matter of Fact during the pandemic on a phone in my bedroom. My
Yeah.
my sons were the ones who were the cameramen, and they hated every moment of it. And that's, like, that's what happens. Suddenly you have a show and you got to do it. And how are you going to do it? I remember doing a 3 camera, if you count your iPhone as a camera,
That's right.
shoots for HBO. And we would just set up, and you have no idea if they're still rolling or not, right? You'd set them up, and I'd have a kid make sure like I was in the shot, and then you'd hope for the best while you did an interview. It's so crazy. But yeah, I mean, that's what's exciting about this time. I think people just come up with solutions. It's a little hard sometimes because the technology moves so fast. that you sort of wrap your head around something and then it changes. But at the end of the day, I think storytelling ultimately stays the same, right? There's different platforms, there's different strategies, there's different modalities, but the actual, like, what makes a good story kind of doesn't change.
Yeah, and I think I always look at kind of how culture impacts how people do things, right? So if you think about yourself being willing to throw up a mic and create a podcast, and then I look at, other people who are well-known public figures who have an audience but won't create it because they don't have the perfect set, or they don't have they want to mimic what they had in television here. And then on the other side, you have the three guys from Smartless start $100 million podcast company by talking to their friends on Zoom. So maybe, like, how do you think culture impacts, like, how people leverage these things, how people tell stories, even in the shift in culture in
Yeah,
social
listen,
media?
I understand the people who needed to be perfect. Right? We were raised in an environment of a studio, and even the shift from network to cable. I left NBC News and started working at CNN,
Yeah.
and before that MSNBC. And in network, if you're going to do a walking shot, you'd be like, your cameraman would say, okay, so we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps, pivot. I'll pick you up with this camera. So you'll turn and then we'll blah, blah, blah. Right.
Yeah.
And you'd kind of map it out. At CNN, you would turn around and be like, oh my gosh, I think this house, blah, 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 come with me. And your cameraman would jog behind you
Yeah.
as you ran through a home after a tornado or after Hurricane Katrina, right? Like, very different strategies in how you think about how are we going to shoot this. And it was just really a mindset shift. Some of that is it's culture, some of that is just what you're used to, and age, like I was that's kind of in between, so I was happily able to do the network thing and then quickly shift to, if you had a great photographer, you could run through a field after Hurricane Katrina and report live at the same time. And so, yeah. And then exactly, then I know lots of people who just couldn't imagine, doing something without it looking perfect. And I'm one of them. I really, at the beginning, made me very uncomfortable. I was one of those, you don't get on TV if you don't have makeup on, like a little
Right.
bit of makeup on. That's
Yeah.
so, like, why would you do that? So it's the rules change. And I think as you are older people, it's a little more challenging. And I think for younger people, it just is like, this is their reality. So it's less challenging. And then they kind of drive the cultural shifts.
Yeah, I mean, but I do think there's an importance in modeling behavior. Like, my hope is that there is someone who sees you with headphones in your bedroom and says, "Well, if Soledad O'Brien can do it, let me go to
With
Best
no
Buy,
makeup on.
right, and buy my mic," right? Because I think, and I think those barriers are important when you talk to access. So I want to talk a little bit about this. Is something I've been thinking about, and I think you're the best person to answer this question. You know, what is the difference today between a creator and a journalist?
Well, that's a really good question. I think there's lots of creators out there who don't think they're journalists and don't want to be journalists. I think journalists, although there's not an official, like, here's your certificate, now you may go to practice some journalism,
Yeah.
has to be about how you report. So I think there's a lot of creators who are not reporting. And I think they would tell you that. Even those creators who are telling stories about
Yeah.
news stories, I think they would say, oh gosh, I'm not a journalist. I think journalists have to hold themselves to a standard about accuracy, about transparency, about fairness in how you tell stories. And I think there are lots of people who call themselves journalists who actually are
Right.
not so good on that front. So, but I think it is a little wishy-washy. And I think that's, now that there's so much more user-generated content, that's much more challenging, right? Like, what does it mean if someone declares themselves a journalist? Are they a journalist? I'm a believer in, yeah, probably yes. Most creators, I don't think, would call themselves journalists. In fact, I think journalists have such a not great name at this moment that I don't
Yeah.
think a creator would feel like they're getting anything out of calling themselves a journalist.
Yeah.
I think they'd be like, oh, I'm definitely not a journalist.
Right, right. It's almost, it's like it's a generational change, right? Like, whereas before people wanted to be a journalist and people don't. But you brought up something that I wanted to dig in deeper about is, do you think there is objective journalism today?
I think we've always focused on this idea of objectivity, which I think is a mistake, because I prefer transparency, right?
Okay.
So, for example, even in the most idiotic thing, Navarro, I'm going to bring you 3 kinds of ice cream, and I want you to report on these 3 ice cream. Right? There's one you like.
Right,
You
right.
like chocolate. You've always liked chocolate. Chocolate is your favorite ice cream, right? So I would just rather know that that's what you like. And you might tell me, oh, this is really great chocolate. Or, I always like chocolate. I'm going to pick the chocolate because I like chocolate. But it's like, it's a transparency. So if if I grew up in a family where my parents were in unions and I'm reporting on a story about unions, I actually think the reporter's point of view and how it was shaped is really interesting. And I think it can add value to the story. I don't think it has to be this is their story, but I think it's interesting to know. And
Right.
so when I hear from reporters, and the New York Times is really particularly miserable about this, so they love to this idea of like, we don't even, I don't even talk about who I'm going to vote. That's a lie. I know you're voting and you have an
Yeah.
idea, and there are things that you think are right and things that you disagree with, and they come from your experience. Right. And that might be your parent was an immigrant, or that might be your parent was a cop, or that might be your parent was the governor, and you have some insight. I'd rather understand like how they think about things, and maybe even how they started to change how they think about things, rather than this idea of like, I have no opinion. I came into this as a blank slate, because they did not. That's a lie. And so they start off by lying about this idea that they're a blank slate when they're not.
Yeah.
That's just not true. So I'd rather have them have informed questions, and then have the transparency of why they're informed that way. So, for example, a lot of stories, especially if you do like when we were doing Black in America, that looked at policing in Black communities. I think there were lots of people who could tell you very honest stories about their experience, their interactions with police. And then I think you could also have police who would tell you very honestly their interactions with community. I don't think either side is lying,
Right.
but they come from a point of view that has a credibility, and I want to understand it. And so if I say, yeah, my dad was a cop, which he wasn't, but if that was my point of view, right, that that adds something to how I'm telling the story.
Yeah.
And I think it's good to be transparent. So I don't know what objective means. I think you want to be fair. You want to be a person who makes sure that you're in how you represent people and in what they say, and you're not creative in your editing, which is easy to do, and that you give people a chance to answer. Sometimes I'll interview people and they say it backwards, right? I know that what they're trying to say, but
Right.
they're nervous, so they flip it. I could run that, right? Where they say a thing that they don't mean, but I know that's not what they're trying to say. I know that
Right.
they mean the opposite, right? So I tell them, "Can you say that again? Because I think you've," and they'll be like, "Oh gosh, I'm sorry." But that's just being fair to the
Right.
person you're interviewing. Whether I agree with them or not, that's just fair. So those are the things that I value more. I think when people tell you that they haven't thought about an issue, that they have no opinion on something, I think that's a lie. I just don't think that's true. Or I'm afraid then that they're going to report on this story. Like, they should be very knowledgeable. They're clearly not. If they haven't spent 1 minute thinking about it enough to form even a basic opinion, why are they even knee deep in telling me this story? They're probably not very well informed.
So if that's the barometer, how do you make that distinction across different platforms? So for example, even in this most recent election cycle, people's biggest complaint is that there's so much misinformation and that the average person doesn't fact check, right? And then if you take it up a level to say a Fox versus a CNN, they are giving very different versions of the same topics. So is it Fox's CNN's responsibility to fact check, but not the influencer who has a mic who's speaking to millions of people on YouTube? Like, what's the barometer?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a little bit of the Wild West, right? I think that Fox and CNN should have a moral imperative as news organizations, but I don't think that the influencer feels like they're bound to that. They don't have to. They're just giving their often incredibly uninformed opinion. I mean, I think Instagram, which I love, is just such a mess for people telling you the craziest things
Yep,
about their diet, what they eat, how, just, I mean, the number of people who weigh in on basic science knowing clearly nothing about basic science is
absolutely.
kind of terrifying.
Yeah,
So yeah, I wish they would. I wish it were, but we're in a really crazy environment now. But the thing that I get annoyed about is those news organizations that know better. For example, CNN is a good example, where they would sometimes, platform people who they know are lying, people who are known
yeah,
liars. My argument would be, then don't put them on, or don't put them on live. If someone is going to lie to you, you can interview them, and then you can say, we're only going to air the part that's factually correct. Listen, if you ask someone their opinion, they're welcome to tell you anything they want. It's their opinion. But if they're going to present it as fact, well, you have the right to say, well, factually, that is not true. That's just not factually true. And so I used to get very frustrated because CNN would platform people who really I thought were lying. And then they'd have a guy come on afterwards, right, and say, "Okay, now time for the fact check." And you're like, "Right, but that horse just ran out of the barn.
Right.
We're locking up the door after the horse left the barn. That's a waste of time. This person has created a narrative, and now your fact checker knows perfectly well that it was bullshit and you've allowed it to get out there." So I think that that's just not a good way of doing it. Now, everybody spins, everybody maneuvers. I get it. But there's some people who just lie. And you need to be able to, I think, serve your audience. I mean, for me, it's always like, are you serving your audience? Are you serving your audience or not? Are you helping them navigate something and understand something complicated? That means you got to stick to the facts.
Well, are we in a space where, so, you talk about generational changes and changes in media, right? And you said before, like, there's no like certificate that says you've done X, Y, and Z. So now you can be a journalist or journaling. And from a numbers perspective, there are more people who watch YouTube than watch CNN or Fox combined, right? And now
By a gajillion, by the
by a
way. Like, you
gajillion,
made that almost sound like it was close.
yeah,
Like,
it's nowhere near, right? And now, there are people today who only watch YouTube on television. So in their mind, it is television.
right.
So,
Yeah.
how do we set those barometers to your point, right? From our generation, we're like CNN and Fox know better because they're news outlets. But there's a generation, where this podcast is on the air on YouTube and other platforms who their only news outlet is YouTube.
Yeah.
So their assumption is the same that, so like, how do we shift and adapt?
That's why we are where we are, right? You're in the middle of this incredible, somewhat terrifying, super interesting shift in news,
Yeah.
right? And I think all the streamers are looking and saying, there's a need and interest in information that the networks are not offering. How do we get in that? I mean, CNN's ratings, even Fox's ratings, while they're often in some cases beat CNN and beat sometimes MSNBC, it's not 10 million viewers. It's
Yeah.
4 million viewers. 4 million in a country of the size we have, or compared to who's on YouTube, is tiny in a
Right.
lot of ways, right? So I think that is the big challenge. I think that is the dilemma, and that is the moment that we're in, where news organizations are trying to figure out what's their role. There was a time when people would say, well, people will look online and just go for the brand names. Well, the brand names have had to also compete with social media, right? So they do more salacious stuff. They
Yeah.
do more over the top. They do,
Yeah.
Often a story will be like 10 dead in a mudslide. You're like, oh my God, where? And then you're like, oh, here, whatever country that, you're like, oh, I don't need to worry about this. It sounded like it was something I had to think about first thing in the morning, but it turns
Right.
out they're making a big deal out of something that is not in my world at all. And so, but you do that obviously to kind of, for a little bit of clickbait to get people to click on. And so that is the game that I think news organizations are playing to try to keep that audience.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely playing catch up. I mean, you remember platforms like the Young Turks, right? Like, they were able to build and establish people who know, like, and trust them, and they've never been on regular, quote unquote, regular television. Well, I want to talk a little bit about, how you've interjected yourself, and I think you've done it in a couple of ways. I think Twitter being the most place you're active, where you've literally fact checked people on Twitter. Like, you're like,
It's
hey, that was
exhausting and it doesn't pay well. It's so exhausting. Well, because what I thought was a really good value add. I've taken a couple of months off of Twitter, but I'll get back to it because Twitter's exhausting,
Yeah.
and it's also very hostile. So sometimes you just kind of have to leave
Yeah.
and get out of there. But I always liked kind of talking to young journalists and be like, so young journos, how was this headline written that could be better? Where is the flaw in this, so that you can see a live example of how a headline writer is using clickbait? Or, I mean, a classic example, right, is there's a headline that's something terrible and the photo is of the people who are the victims, but you wouldn't know. And it sort of says like, man kills family, blah, blah, blah. And often, more than 5 times, I would say, I've seen examples of, man kills family, and the photo is of a beautiful family. Everybody's smiling and they look amazing, right? And then sometimes if it's a person of color, it's often like a really terrible, horrible
Yeah.
shot. And you assume that person is the perpetrator. And in fact, they're the victim of something that has happened. But there's, and it's a way, again, I think, of just getting clickbait. And so, you can track those things. There are a lot of people who do track those ways in which we tell stories and how we frame things. And for me, framing is kind of everything, right? It's so I spend a lot of time on Twitter when I'm on Twitter trying to help people understand, like, how is this framed wrong? How should it be framed? What is when you read the actual story, what is the actual story? Okay, so
Right.
then why is the headline a complete mess? I think that's kind of interesting. And again, I think everybody has an expertise that they can bring. And I have tried on social media to say, here's my area of expertise that I can be helpful with.
So aside from the trolls, how have people reacted? Like, the thing, one of the main things that excites me about technology is I can be on the internet and have a chat with Soledad O'Brien about a headline, right? So tell me, like, it's easy to say, I'm sure there's people who have negative opinions, but have people reached out and kind of
Oh,
what
a
is kind of,
ton, a
yeah, what
ton.
is
I
that?
love
Right.
it. Listen, it's the greatest thing for journalism, honestly, because you cut out the middleman. I mean, it used to be if I wanted to talk to someone, I'd have to call their people. Their people would say, well, hold on, Soledad, I'm going to reach out to them and I'm going to get back to you tomorrow, see if they want to talk to you. Right now, you just hit them up, right?
Yep.
And that person will be like, oh, this is interesting. Let's move this to a DM. Let's chat. And so I think it's fascinating. So I love that aspect of it. And yeah, I think anybody who's on Twitter enough or on any social media gets pretty good at learning how to kind of just tune out the trolls and just ignore them and not, what do they always say? Don't read the comments. But every so often you see a long, overwrought note about I'm leaving this platform.
Right.
You're like, and often they come back, because they
They
can't
leave it
stay
for a
away.
day and
They
then they're
leave for a
back tomorrow.
day and with a long essay about how, it reminds me of when people would do this is why I'm leaving New York. I'm finally leaving New York. So it's a little bit like that. I'm leaving Instagram. I'm leaving Twitter. I tend not to be dramatic about it. I just leave and then
Right.
say, I just can't take the garbage. And then I hop back in when there's something interesting to talk about. But yeah, I think it's not for the faint of heart. I think people have I remember one time I posted a picture of my kids and a whole bunch of the comments were like, your children are so ugly. And it was so funny because my kids, who are kind of a perfect age for this,
Yeah.
right? They weren't so little that they just thought it was the funniest thing
Right.
that like people would weigh in on kind of like what they look like. And they weren't so old that they didn't understand like
Right.
how it worked. And they weren't so young that it hurt their feelings, that it was just kind of just right. Like they think it's hilarious. But I think all of it has to be, it's just another platform and it's another way to think about, how to convey information.
I think there might be another business idea. Soledad O'Brien teaches a masterclass on online journalism on
Ignoring
YouTube.
people.
Right. And how to ignore people in the comments.
Here's
So
why I'm leaving New York.
here's why I always say that anybody who's really doing something doesn't tell you about it. And the people who tell you about it, they want you to say, please don't leave. I don't want you to, I want you to stay.
That's the best. That's the best.
So, as you think about kind of where we are and where we're going, and if someone watches this, what would you say to someone, again, we say that there's muddied lines between journalists and creator, but really what we have is a generation of people who have seen that the barriers are lower to connect to other people, right? Like you can literally go from we're in our collective spaces and connect with thousands and millions of people. So what would you say to them how can someone connect with people as a journalist, as a creator? Like what would be your advice to them about how they do that or how they
I
go about
love it. I think it's the greatest thing. And it's so different than when you and I started our conversations back in the early 2000s,
it?
right?
Yep.
Like it is amazing that there can be a tornado happening and you have a person who's right. Used to be where CNN made its name. We would send our teams. They'd be standing out the minute it happened. I was one of them, right? We'd be running through. That's right. That's right. Here's what's happening right now. Like pan the camera over there. Now people are standing there with their phones, uploading them and reporting and
Yep.
showing us the vision, and in communities that we might not ever get to. I find that amazing and fascinating. I think it's a glut of information. It's a lot, and it has to be managed and processed by people who are trying to, figure out what kinds of stories that they want to tell. But if you're a creator or you're a journalist, it's always been that there's just a lot of incoming data and you have to decide, all right, well, what is the story? How do I tell that story? And who are the trusted voices, who have something to say? Every story, breaking news story I've ever been on, there's always a guy. It's always a guy, by the way. And he's like, Yeah, I heard the explosion. I was right there. You're just like you were always, always. And when I was in local news, or like a guy, oh, it was a guy leaning against the thing. I saw the whole thing. I saw the whole thing. Come over here.
Right.
I have an interview I want to do. It's kind of a metaphor for that's how you have to navigate it, right? There's always going to be somebody who's probably got some kind of bullshit coming at you. But there are people who have stuff to say, and you sometimes have to really hunt for them. That's the journalism, in my mind, part of it, the hunting, the searching, the researching, the finding, the data collection, the piecing it together, what makes sense, what sticks out as not making sense. Like that's the work of journalism. So I think it's a really interesting time. I'm a not nauseatingly optimistic person. So I love when there's big shifts. I love when there's change because I feel like, oh gosh, something new is coming down the pike. This is going to be really, really interesting. And I think that's where we are, certainly in journalism. Like there is going to be a lot of change over the next 10 years, the demographics, the data around who's watching, like all that stuff is really impacting where these audiences going and what's it going to look like. I don't know.
So if we closed out and kind of, coin someone the connected journalist for this next generation, to me it sounds like it's not just capturing the story, but taking a second and saying, how can you tell the deeper story? How can
Yeah,
you tell the
always,
secondary
always. The
story?
good reporting for me is always in the context, right? It's one of the things that I yell at people about is you have to actually give people context for a story. Americans we're very ahistoric people, right? We believe poor people just one day showed up poor. This community just popped in there. That's where they've been, as opposed to like, no, there were circumstances and events and things that happened that moved people into communities, history that unfolded
Right.
that made things happen. And we just often don't really understand that. And so for me, I think it's a lot about like, here's what's unfolding right now, let me give you the context for what's been happening in this community so you understand. Again, I think the election is a really good example. I always love like understanding why people do what they do and what has happened in their community that they do something. I think it's kind of interesting, this horrible, I mean, it's been really terrible, the reaction to this United Healthcare CEO being killed. I mean, it's some people I think are just comedians and they just are kind of
Yeah.
milking it inappropriately for
Yeah.
comedy. But I think there's a bunch of people who are literally giddy. I was watching a woman reporter who I kind of know, was on Piers Morgan's show, which is a show I do not watch, but I saw a clip. Sorry about that. And she was basically saying she was joyful. This was an actual reporter. I mean, it was like the craziest thing I'd ever seen. She was joyful about somebody being shot down in cold blood, which is very different than, I understand the frustration of every single person who's ever been put on hold by their insurance company and told they're not going to pay for something that we all know that should be covered under our insurance plans. So I think it's like helping people understand context is really critical. And I think that's the reporter's job, to kind of winnow through so we understand where we are kind of in the world and in this time.
No, you're right. I think, I always say, the internet is like the little tool from IKEA. Like you can build a desk or stab someone in the eye, right? Like the tool doesn't change. And I think what's important to take away from this is there's an opportunity for you to laugh callously at the death of another, or there's an opportunity for you to take that advantage to tell a story of a wider group of people who that is an example of their pain to an extreme, but show the benefits and show the opportunities that can come from it. So my hope is like anyone who watches this like gets inspired to tell that story as opposed to the mediocre middle that, to your point, is just being salacious. So
Yeah.
so no, I think that's a great place to kind of cap it. Soledad, I think I'd love for people to know where to find you. Like we can't have you on a podcast without telling them your social handles. So if you can
Sure,
tell
sure.
them.
I'm always Soledad O'Brien, one word, SoledadObrien. Never put an apostrophe in, ever, is what I've learned in life. Those of
Never.
us with apostrophes cannot ever put them in anything. And then I'm anchoring a show called Matter of Fact, which is a weekly show that looks at policy in America. And then I run a doc company. My real full time job is a production company called Soledad O'Brien Productions.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate the time as always. I had to book a podcast to have a conversation. We haven't talked in a really
It is
while.
so true. How sad is
I
that?
mean, it's a sad state of affairs for me. Part of the reason in doing this is an opportunity. I truly believe that everyone's an opportunity or an access away from doing something different, and Soledad is probably the greatest, if not the first example of someone who gave me an opportunity. Like I look back and like she didn't have to interview me on that documentary, but since she did, it exposed me to a whole bunch of people and allowed me to connect and impact a lot of people.
You were
So
just good on TV. Well, I mean, thank you for all of that. But actually, you know what happened is you were good on TV, period, full stop. Some people do it and they're bad, and then it just goes away, like it just ends. You would not have been in the doc if you had been bad on TV, would have been like, oh, that guy, okay, well, let's, edit him out. That's just not going to work.
yeah, no, I appreciate it. And even still, there's some people who walk by and they're like, I know you from somewhere. I can't, and, they want you to name the places. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's it.
Right. They
So
always think they went to college. Did we go to college
that's
together? We
right.
know each other from college.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Well, so that I appreciate it. This has been fantastic. Thank you again. And I can't thank you enough for spending your time with me today.
It was my pleasure, of course.
Take care.